10 Stages of Genocide and India's Muslims. My name is Tina Ramirez. Fresh from the horror of the Second World War, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution in 1946 providing the first globally mandated definition of genocide. That resolution said genocide is a denial of the right of the existence of entire human groups. As homicide is the denial of the right to live of individual human beings, such denial of the right of existence shocks the conscience of mankind. 2 years later, in 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Calling genocide an odious scourge, the convention said any acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life and calculated to bring about that group's physical destruction, in whole or in part, amount to genocide. By that definition, experts say a genocide of India's 200 million Muslims is well and truly underway. Indian Muslims and other human rights defenders allege that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government is not only complicit in the large-scale persecution of India's Muslims, but is actually leading it from the front. And the pillars of India's democratic system, from the legislature to the executive to even the judiciary, have all but collapsed in the face of this genocidal behavior. Let us take a look at how the police aided and abetted the violence against Muslims in Delhi in February.
डीसीपी साहब हमारे सामने खड़े हैं। मैं आप सबके बिहाफ पे ये बात कह रहा हूँ, ट्रंप के जाने तक तो हम शांति से जा रहे हैं, लेकिन उसके बाद हम आपकी भी नहीं सुनेंगे अगर रास्ते खाली नहीं हुए। भारत माता की जय! मातरम! मातरम!
The man in this video, Kapil Mishra, is a leader of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party. Within hours of his threat, Hindu extremists burnt Muslim neighborhoods to the ground in India's capital. In less than a week, dozens were brutally killed, most of them Muslims. Amnesty International reported that Delhi police were complicit and an active participant in the violence. 10 months later, no investigation has been opened into the police. Instead, the police have arrested hundreds of Muslims and charged them with carrying out the violence. Whereas Amnesty spoke to survivors, eyewitnesses, lawyers, doctors, human rights activists, and retired police officers, and analyzed several user-generated videos, the police themselves have failed to conduct a fair and independent investigation. When a judge in Delhi ordered criminal charges filed against Mr. Mishra, he was transferred out of Delhi the same night. The Chief Justice of India's Supreme Court publicly said the courts can do nothing to stop the violence. Until now, police have not once questioned Mr. Mishra nor investigated his role. Amnesty found the police stopped medical help from reaching the victims and also failed to rescue them. Many victims were those who had for months protested a new citizenship law that discriminates against Muslims. Amnesty said the police used excessive and arbitrary use of force on protesters, including custodial torture. Most Muslims who were tortured were detained illegally, and police refused to sign their release documents. After Amnesty published its report in August, Mr. Modi's government froze the watchdog's bank accounts and started threatening its staff. Weeks later, Amnesty announced it was suspending operations in India. 10 months later, hundreds continue to languish in prison, including victims of the violence, as well as prominent human rights activists such as Umar Khalid, a youth leader of international and national renown for whose release 200 global intellectuals, including Noam Chomsky, have written a public letter. Thousands who fled their homes are yet to return as they fear repeat attacks from Hindu extremists. Refugee camps have shut after continuous harassments from officials and the police. Mr. Modi has met the Delhi violence with stony silence.
To discuss the escalating escalating violence against Indian Muslims, I am joined with experts from across the world. Dr. Gregory Stanton joins me from McLean, Virginia. He is the founder and president of Genocide Watch, an organization that works to predict, prevent, stop, and punish genocide and other forms of mass murder. Dr. Stanton served in the U.S. State Department in the 1990s when he drafted the UN Security Council resolutions that created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the Burundi Commission of Inquiry, and the Central African Arms Flow Commission. Until last year, he was a research professor in genocide studies and prevention at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University in Arlington, Virginia. Joining from India is Tista Setalvad, a well-known human rights defender and convener of Citizens for Justice and Peace, a nonprofit that works to advance civil and political rights, especially of the social and religious minorities. After Hindu mobs attacked and killed more than 1,000 Muslims in 2002 in Gujarat state when Mr. Modi was its chief minister, Ms. Setalvad did years of pioneering work in exposing and bringing to justice the perpetrators of that violence, leading to more than 150 convictions in courts. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government has long tried to put her in prison on false criminal charges. Also joining me from India is Qasim Rasul Ilyas, a veteran Muslim civil and political activist who is the spokesman for the All India Muslim Personal Law Board. His son is Umar Khalid, a globally recognized human rights defender who's been falsely accused of inciting violence and arrested just weeks ago under the most draconian of Indian laws. Global icons such as Noam Chomsky, Salman Rushdie, and Arundhati Roy have signed open letters seeking Umar Khalid's release. And joining from the Netherlands is Rutumbra Manuvi, an assistant professor at the Department of Law at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She is also the executive director of the London Story, a non-profit foundation that works on hate speech and hate crimes. As a Commonwealth scholar at the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Manuvi conducted research on the construction of citizenship in Assam, the Indian state where Mr. Modi's government has controversially designated 2 million residents as foreigners, following a dubious process called the National Register for Citizens. And finally, joining from Chicago is Rashid Ahmed, Executive Director of the Indian American Muslim Council, a U.S.-based nonprofit engaged in advocating for civil, political, and religious rights in India. Dr. Stanton, let me start with you. As part of your work with the U.S. State Department, you designed the 10 stages of genocide. What does it mean? Isn't genocide the act of mass killing? And why has Genocide Watch issued genocide alerts for the Indian provinces of Kashmir and Assam?
Genocide is more than just killing people. It is not only killing people, it is also causing serious physical or mental harm to members of the group that is intended to destroy the group. It is also creating conditions of life for the group that are intended to destroy the group, such as driving them out, not letting them have food or water or a lot of other basics, that taking away children of the group, preventing births within the group. Those are all acts of genocide besides killing. We see all of these things already happening in Kashmir, for instance. I think that these types of killings, for instance, that have been going on in Kashmir have in fact already been genocidal in nature. The army has, I believe, 600,000 Indian troops in Kashmir. This is for a very small population compared to the rest of India, and yet, why are they there? You have to say that there is a real possibility of genocidal violence there.
What are the early stages of genocide, and how do they apply to Muslims in India, including in Assam, where a dubious citizenship headcount targeting Muslims has been carried out?
The first is classification. Now, in the case of Assam, the classification is the Indian citizenry, including mostly Hindus in Assam, but also other religions, and then the Bengali Muslims, many of whom, however, have lived there for several generations. So the classification is actually between Muslims and Hindus for the most part. The second stage is symbolization, in which certain symbols are attached to these different groups. probably the most relevant one here in India is the symbolization on temples. For instance, the mosque that was torn down and is now being rebuilt as a Hindu temple again for the god Ram is a mark of symbolization. And these are important in development of what you could call the cultural underpinnings for genocide. The third stage is discrimination, in which people of a particular group, one of those classified groups, is discriminated against. In the case of India, it is very clear now that the people who are being discriminated against, especially in Assam and Kashmir, are Muslims. And you know, they've even locked up a lot of the Muslim leaders in Kashmir, for instance. The population in Assam has actually been required to register, including registration of their religious group. And that means that they then can be discriminated against in many ways. They may not even be considered citizens of India. When you lose your citizenship, you lose all of the rights that go with citizenship.
We just heard Dr. Stanton talk about how the early stages of genocide happening to Indian Muslims. Tista, how are the non-state actors targeting India's Muslims?
Hate speech and hate rioting is one way in which this classification stroke demonization happens. And we are seeing many sections, not all, but many sections of the commercial television media actually in cahoots with this ideology of the center, of the central government and many state government, the RSS ideology, of constantly using this kind of terminology in hysterical telecasts, which succeed in, with the Hindi language, with other non-English speaking languages, regional languages, constantly sowing this notion of discriminating this particular section, classifying this particular section, number one, as people who've been appeased in the past by previous governments, those whose patriotism is questioned, those whose cultural values are questioned, and of course whose religion itself is now the subject of hate speech and hate riot, Islam. So one very, very powerful example is the way one of the mainstream Indian channels, which is not seen to be quote unquote sectarian or communal, India Today, ran an extremely questionable program soon after the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic outbreak in mid-March 2020, when they actually stigmatized and completely did this hysterical coverage of this religious gathering of the Tablighi Jamaat in the capital of New Delhi in mid-March, before the lockdown had been announced by the Prime Minister. And the coverage was of a kind that actually fits into the internationally now accepted concept of journalism as genocide. And for close to a fortnight, we saw that this kind of coverage about Muslim religious gathering was going on. And the result was that the notion of the Tablighi Jamaati stroke Muslim being the super spreader of the coronavirus actually percolated down to the small villages and streets of India, to the markets of India, so that ostracization, social boycott, etc. started taking place, not buying from Muslim-owned shops, not going to Muslim bakeries, etc. So much so that a young Muslim man in the northern state of Himachal Pradesh, Danish, actually took his own life after being completely horrified and traumatized by the segregation.
Qasim Rasul Ilyas, you are a prominent Muslim leader in India, and your son, who is a prominent human rights activist, has been jailed on bogus criminal charges. What kind of genocide do India's Muslims face?
In Modi's India, genocide is educated and implemented wherever is possible. A genocide is not only a physical elimination or ethnic cleansing of a group, race, or a community, but it is also social, political, psychological, and economical elimination. Muslims in India are facing all types of genocides. Muslim bashing is used as a tool to polarize people for electoral benefits, and the majority citizens are made to believe that it is a necessary evil that is essentially good for the country, that is fake nationalism, and the following methods are employed to achieve it. Number one, assimilation. Muslims are forced to surrender their separate religious and cultural identity and become part of mainstream culture. Number two, Muslims are reduced to second-grade citizens, and it has been said that they got share in the form of Pakistan, hence should not demand equal status and equal rights, and should remain subservient to the majority community. Third, Muslims are subjected to communal onslaught and violence. If they fail to fall in line, must face the wrath of majority community.
Dr. Stanton, what Tista and Qasim Rasul Ilyas have just described, tell us now about the fourth stage of genocide.
The fourth stage is dehumanization, in which you literally start calling the other group by inhuman names. You call them a cancer in the body politic, or a disease, or some kind of column of enemies within, of possible traitors. That sort of language is what is used for dehumanization. The most famous cases, of course, were the way the Nazis called the Jews vermin, rats, and in Rwanda how the Hutus called the Tutsis cockroaches. This sort of dehumanization can then also lead to the next stage, which is organization, in which you have groups that are actually organized to commit acts of hatred, including violence, against the targeted group. We've seen that in the RSS in particular, in India. The RSS has been a hate group from the start. As you know, it was an RSS militant who assassinated Mohandas Gandhi. These organized groups, and the RSS is very strong even now, including domination of a lot of the BJP party. You've got an organized group there that is capable then of carrying out the planning and other things necessary for crimes against humanity and even genocide.
Rashid Ahmed.
Indeed, a year ago, India's Home Minister Amit Shah, who is Prime Minister Modi's confidant and himself has been accused of masterminding extrajudicial killings of innocent Muslims in the past, announced that a nationwide NRC would be carried out to find the foreigners, whom he called termites. That, by the way, is a classical example of Dr. Stanton's fourth stage of genocide, dehumanization. Like the Nazis called Jews vermin, or like in Rwanda, the Hutus called the Tutsis cockroaches. So what seems to be the final solution? Create a nationwide NRC, designate hundreds of millions of Indians as foreigners because they don't have proof of citizenship going back decades and generations since long before independent India, as happened in Assam. With CAA, if you are a Hindu and no citizenship paper, you can apply for citizenship, but not if you are a Muslim. This keeps Muslims permanently outside the pale of Indian citizenship, even though they have lived in India for centuries. That's how the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, the mentorship of Mr. Modi's political party, a Hindu nationalist organization founded 95 years ago, wants to bring into existence its plan to convert India into a Hindu nation, Muslims and Christians as second-class citizens, if that.
As the Indian government brought the CAA, the citizenship law, hundreds of thousands of Muslims protested across the country. The government responded with brute force and suppression. Here's a report.
This is Delhi's Junta Munta. Like London Speaker's Corner, a place where freedom to speak is guaranteed. Freedom to tweet, though, has been interrupted. The local internet connections have been switched off. Stifling cyberspace these days is a well-known tactic for India's government when faced with dissent. Marches scheduled for this day's protest against India's new Citizenship Amendment Act in 15 cities across India were mostly banned. Thousands tried to take part anyway. In Delhi, just those boxed in here were allowed to carry on. Delhi's police have been fairly successful in trying to break up these demonstrations, but they have concentrated and allowed them to do so here at the Jantar Mantar. But the people here are adamant that these demonstrations, the protests against this legislation, are going to continue. Police blocked access roads and cut the mobile internet outside the Red Fort where the Delhi march was supposed to begin. Opponents of the new law, which allows migrants from Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan to seek Indian citizenship, so long as they are not Muslim, say that it's sectarian and undermines India's secular constitution. The government insists that it's designed to protect minorities.
We have negotiated the leadership. They are requesting them to disperse peacefully. Yeah, we have full faith in their leaders and they will go. We are telling them...
But many remain defiant, accusing authorities of threatening their futures.
Today morning, acting so undemocratically, people have detained our leaders. They have dragged them from the site and they have clearly told students to disperse. Otherwise, they will face serious consequences.
India's Supreme Court will begin deliberations on whether the law does discriminate against the nation's 200 million Muslims and violates the constitution next month. On the streets here, though, there's no doubt among protesters that it does.
I'm here because I find this act, the Citizenship Amendment Act, completely unconstitutional, anti-people, arbitrary, and against the basic feature of the Indian Constitution.
India's ruling party, the BJP, has an overwhelming majority in the legislature, and it runs the security forces. So it's able to smother efforts to fight it online. So it's back to the good old-fashioned human voice.
The RSS that Dr. Stanton and Rashid Ahmed mentioned was founded in 1925 as an explicitly Hindu nationalist group. Prime Minister Modi's BJP party is an offshoot of the RSS. Tista, what can you tell us about the RSS's ideology?
It is an ideology which, though has come to power democratically, it is governed by an extremely retrograde idea of a controlled authoritarian theocratic state, of a visualized in a quote-unquote Hindutva nation. I won't even say Hindu nation because it militarizes the Hindu religion in its use and concept. And in its very definition by the own books and the own literature of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, that actually is the ideological anchor of the Bharatiya Janata Party that rules, they have already defined the three internal enemies of this visualized nation, which is in the making for them. And the internal enemies of this visualized nation are Muslims, Christians and communists. If you expand the last term, it means any political dissenter, any ideology that actually speaks against the theocratic Hindutva state. So the first category, therefore the sharply defined category is India's Muslims, where while there are also others we must point out who are the enemies of this visualized nation. And when it comes to India's Muslims, we are seeing, and we've been seeing for some time actually, since the 1980s and 90s, as this ideology grew in political strength through mobilization, violence, the bloody Rath Yatra that led to the demolition of the Babri Masjid on 6 December 1992, etc. We've seen classification stroke demonization. Even today we are seeing it.
Rashid Ahmed, India's new citizenship law, the Citizenship Amendment Act, excludes Muslim migrants from an expedited path to citizenship. How did the Indian government respond to the nationwide protests against the CAA?
In the last 1 year, to carry out full-scale attacks against Muslims, after Indian Parliament legislated the citizenship law in December, millions of citizens took to the streets across India. The largest protest started and mostly led by Muslim women. What Mr. Modi's government responded with brute force, with the Indian police attacking protesters, including women. Police attacked 2 prominent Muslim universities, one in Delhi, viciously beating them up on campus. Videos have emerged from across the country of the police firing bullets straight into unarmed protesters vandalizing Muslim homes and properties. This brutality is widely reported by international news media. Police in Uttar Pradesh state, which is also ruled by Mr. Modi's BJP, entered an Islamic school and attacked underage male students, many of them preteen, sodomizing some of them, causing rectal bleeding. None of the policemen involved have even been questioned or investigated. According to Human Rights Watch, the Modi government's policy has reflected an anti-Muslim bias as the police failed to intervene when BJP supporters engaged in speeches inciting violence or mob attacks. At the same time, police had been quick to arrest critics of the government. During the protests against the citizenship law, when BJP-affiliated groups attacked protesters, the police did not intervene. But in BJP-governed states, police used excessive and unnecessary lethal force, killing at least 30 people during protest and injuring scores more, Human Rights Watch said.
Dr. Stanton, under the NRC, Mr. Modi's government plans to ask all Indians for citizenship proof going back generations, which will be impossible for hundreds of millions to provide. As Rashid Ahmed just told us, when Muslims protested against the citizenship law and the NRC, police and Hindu extremists carried out mass violence against them. Police have now arrested thousands of Muslims who are bizarrely now being accused of violence against themselves. In the state of Uttar Pradesh, which Mr. Modi's party rules, the police killed 20 Muslims in one day. How do you see all of this? Is this part of a genocidal pattern?
I don't know if it will reach the level of actual mass killing, but this kind of really systematic crimes against humanity is already underway. That's what you're describing. And in fact, this idea of blaming the victim, by the way, is part of the 10th stage of genocide, which I should have also described. Denial is the 10th stage of every genocide, and it starts actually at the beginning and goes all the way through to the end and afterwards. In other words, that's why it's not a linear model. It's not, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In fact, you'll have denial all the way through. So blaming the victims is one of the most common tactics of people who want to deny they're doing anything wrong. That's what's going on when they're charging Muslims with, would you believe it, killing themselves? I don't believe it, and I don't think anybody should believe it. It is a very common tactic of denial. There will also be lots of other tactics, like saying these statistics are exaggerated, or that, after all, they attacked us first. In other words, using kind of a self-defense kind of a argument. These sorts of denial are very common in genocidal situations, and they are used as justifications. That's why they're so dangerous. And so, yes, I think that this type of denial, these actual arrests of the people who are the victims, is a very worrying sign.
The opponents of the citizenship law say it has been brought in only to restore the citizenship of the Hindus and other non-Muslims who may fail to furnish proof of citizenship during the NRC, whereas Muslims will be declared foreigners. What do you think?
Oh, it's very clear discrimination, no question. And what it boiled down to is it is a form of exclusionary ideology, which we find in Hindutva, this ideology of the BJP, that really Hindus are the only real Indians, and that everybody else was an invader. That's the kind of ideology you're up against here. And what we have is a law, the Citizenship Amendment Act, that specifically allows for naturalization, if you will, of refugees, for instance, from other countries that are of many religions, Christians, Hindus, you name it, Buddhists, others, but not Muslims. It specifically excludes Muslims. And guess why? Because it is an anti-Muslim law. There's no doubt about it. It's a discriminatory law. In fact, I believe it's a violation of the Indian Constitution, which guarantees equal protection of the laws.
Tista, you have been deeply involved at the grassroots in Assam with the NRC process, the National Register for Citizens. which has been disastrous because nearly 2 million people there have been deemed foreigners. How would the CAA and the NRC taken together hurt the Muslims?
We are seeing in front of our eyes what has happened in Assam over the last 2.5, 3 decades, in the name of weeding out infiltrators. You have constitutional senior people in this present government using terms like termites to describe possibly those who don't have Indian citizenship. And the whole question about who is Assamese, who is not, do Bengali Hindus, do Bengali speaking Muslims who've lived there for 150 years have a right to citizenship in that state, has been simmering for a while. With all that conflict behind us, a kind of a process for the registration of the National Register of Citizens within Assam was agreed upon under Supreme Court supervision. Lot of controversies, lot of anomalies. I won't go into those here. But after all of that process and a huge cost to the state and huge cost to an unlettered population, a final list was prepared and published on 31st of August 2019, which finally excluded 1.9 million people from Indian citizenship. Now, when the figures came out and the demographics became clear, it became clear that just 500,000 people of these were of the Muslim faith. So already you see the very rabid right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party that rules the state of Assam threatening that if you bring us back to power next year, the state elections are due, we'll ensure that we'll go through this entire process again. Now, what has the NRC registration process, the de-voter process, the declared foreigner process, this whole citizenship test in Assam has cost not just economic growth and GDP to that state, but has traumatized a huge population and threatens to, of course, the final list has excluded Bengali-speaking Hindus and tribals and indigenous peoples and also the Nepalis, Gorkhas. But it is likely that policies might be pursued through which all of these people will be included and only the Muslims would be targeted and excluded. That's the fear. If an all-India documented test of citizenship is brought about under the Citizenship Amendment Act, under the NRC, etc., etc., it's very, very likely that again the Muslims will be a target. However, as we've been pointing out for the last year and a quarter, ever since the Citizenship Amendment Bill, an unconstitutional amendment was passed in December 2019, the idea is to use one or the other to exclude Muslims. But finally, when the documented test takes place, it's likely to exclude the migrant worker, the Adivasi, the indigenous person, the Dalit, etc. However, politically, the target remains the Muslim.
Dr. Ratumbra Manuvi, you are a professor of law at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and you have extensively researched the Assam citizenship controversy and the NRC. Tell us how it created a culture of discrimination, bigotry, and violence.
One must look into what happened in Assam NRC to understand what is happening in India right now and why a nationwide NRC is an inhuman project bound to end in massive statelessness, persecution, and possible extermination of Indian Muslims. Assam had a long-drawn struggle with alleged other, which can be historically traced back to pre-colonial times. After Indian independence and during the Great Migration between India and Pakistan, while the people migrating in the state of Punjab and Rajasthan were received with a narrative of homecoming, in state of Assam, those migrating from East Pakistan were received with the narrative of infiltrators and outsiders. After a violent power struggle and promulgation of Assam Accord in 1980s, the state in Assam was given the power to identify who they considered to be outsider and use pushback methods to hurl people into Bangladesh boundaries if they were suspected to be an outsiders. A vigilantism and a highly polarized atmosphere was created which resulted in several massacres, including the Nilli massacre. However, what has gone unattended and invisible for a long time is that the state has continuously dehumanized its citizens, reducing their political identity by maintaining a doubtful voter list since 1980s. In this list, any person whose standing as a citizen is contested by any other person could be listed. For example, the state in Assam gives me power to anonymously raise doubt on citizenship status of any other person residing in 100 kilometers radius from me. My mere raising of the doubt will mandate that the state official must mark that person as a doubtful voter, and such other person can prove their relation to the state by going to a judicial tribunal with a set of documents which identify them as an Indian citizen. These documents include birth certificate, legacy certificate, land records, etc. However, 48% of the births in India are unregistered and not everyone owns a land. In 2004, the Supreme Court of India declared the doubtful voter list as an unconstitutional process because of the enormity of documentation that it requires and the onus of proof that is put on a person who perhaps is not capable of procuring those documents. Despite being declared unconstitutional, the state in Assam has maintained and updated a D-voter list even prior to the 2016 general elections.
This is shocking and hard to believe. How did all of this influence the NRC process?
The process of national citizenship registration in Assam was instituted to standardize the doubtful citizenship construction and identify who is an Indian citizen once for all. The process required everyone claiming to be a citizen of the state to produce a set of legacy and land document to identify themselves. The requirement to prove one's citizenship was essentially the same as the requirement to prove oneself as not a D voter. It also thus had the same problems of lack of documentary evidence. So when the state published its final NRC list and 1.9 million people did not find their names in it, it was not at all surprising. If one pays a closer look at these 1.9 million people, one would realize that they are traditionally women who lack documents. They are likely to be religious and ethnic minority groups who lack capital of identification. But more than that, they are the people who are identified as others. Even during the NRC process in Assam, the hateful narrative of otherizing found an unhealthy company in the social media. The calls of outsiders invading Assamese soil or taking away the land resources was deeply etched. Terminology such as Bangladeshi termites, jihadi, rapists were used to describe minority groups, and calls were raised that no self-respecting Assamese officer should let these outsiders to be identified as Indian citizens. The general lack of documentation made it easier for the state to exercise its discretion and dehumanize 1.9 million people by snatching away their citizenship status and making it political to lodge them in detention centers for indefinite period of time. The situation of Assam is not peculiar to the state of Assam alone. It mirrors what is happening in India and what will perhaps become much worse if we don't pay attention.
Qasim Rasool Ilyas, I want to talk quickly about Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous state. It has about 220 million people, about 20% of whom are Muslims. What is the status of the Muslims under the rule of the Hindu nationalist BJP government?
The Chief Minister, Mr. Adityanath, is a known enemy of Muslims. He himself is the main architect of systematic Muslim bashing. From encounter killing to illegal arrest, fake cases to illegal detentions, every method is employed. During the last elections, they have started a campaign against Muslims with the slogan, "With you or without you, we will form the government."
After Mr. Modi became Prime Minister, lynchings of Muslims shot up. Here's a report.
This is one of several viral videos showing violence by so-called cow vigilantes in India. Self-appointed guardians of cows, which are sacred to Hindus, claim they're being illegally slaughtered, and they're not afraid to use violence to stop that. For every victim, there's also a family left behind. Sajida's son Anas Qureshi was killed in 2015 along with two other young men from this village less than 50 kilometers from New Delhi.
How can anyone who's lost their son live in peace? We are devastated. His father has been suffering from mental tension. All of us are stressed. No punishment was given to the perpetrators. No attention was paid to us.
A Human Rights Watch report states that 8 lynching cases they studied involved victims who are considered lower caste Hindus. The vast majority of those killed, however, were Muslims.
The victims come from rural and poor areas like this, not always far from major cities. Lynchings such as these were known to take place in the past, but they were rare. Now, 36 cases have been reported since 2015, with some activists saying the real number is much higher.
In September 2018, India's Supreme Court ordered central and state governments to take what it called preventative and punitive measures to stop such attacks after most states failed to comply with its previous directive. This social rights worker spent a year and a half documenting cases of so-called cow vigilantism. While there have been convictions, including that of 11 men in March last year, she says the problem persists.
The numbers on the ground are likely to be even higher. And what we need to look at is not just people who have died from the lynchings, but the spate of attacks on people.
Various cow vigilantes operate across the country looking for those they believe are slaughtering cows. But not every cow protection group advocates violence. The head of this cow shelter says he understands why some groups are violent.
Look at the reason behind people committing violence for cow protection, because they are actually safeguarding an important thing. The government is negligent. Do not provoke us.
For the victims' families, added to their loss is the sense of abandonment by their government, left to feel as just another statistic on a growing list. Faiz Jamil, Al Jazeera, Dasna, Uttar Pradesh.
Let's talk about the lynching of Muslims that has sharply escalated since Mr. Modi became Prime Minister in 2014. Tista, why are Muslims being lynched in the name of cow protection?
You have cattle traders all over the country, cattle traders belonging to different faiths. You have, in fact, the agrarian community. Many of them are other backward castes, both Hindu and Muslim, largely Hindu, who find that after a certain age, it is not economically productive to keep cattle and their progeny alive, which is why they go into the biological cycle of going in for slaughter, skin use, etc. However, by using this entire bogey of the cow being slaughtered when actually it's not being slaughtered, you're finding that it is the Muslim cattle trader who is actually just selling and buying cattle, not slaughtering it, who's being targeted in very brute acts of targeted violence that are taking place. The phrase is like appeasement. I mean, has the Muslim community, which we know socio-economically is among the most backward in the country. In some cases, the Sachar Committee report of 2005-06 actually pointed out, which was a prime ministerial report, pointed out that in fact, in many cases, the condition, economic status of Muslims has gone worse in some areas, even worse in the scheduled castes who are Dalits. But however, constantly using this term appeasement to suggest that regimes who are not the RSS BJP regimes have actually, by simply giving a few political sops to the minorities, so lack of opportunities, lack of social opportunities, lack of economic opportunities, constant fear and insecurity amongst the Indian Muslims, which is generated through this abrasive exclusionary tactics of hate speech and othering, is something that could possibly fit in to the build-up to a genocidal situation.
Rashid Ahmed.
The ascension of Mr. Modi to India's prime ministership has brought India's 200 million Muslims close to a genocide. Mr. Modi's government has long enabled non-state actors belonging to what is called the RSS family to carry out murderous vigilante attacks on Muslims across the country. Hundreds have been so far killed, often on camera, but without any consequences for the perpetrators or killers, while on video, live. In fact, in incident after incident, BJP leaders have immediately came in defense of the perpetrators, creating a groundswell of public support through social media and other means for the killers and against the victims. Blaming the victims, yet another stage of genocide being fulfilled in India during the Modi regime. It is commonplace to read about one after another group of men accused of lynching Muslims being acquitted, by the Indian trial court, citing lack of evidence, primarily because the deliberate misinformation in the initial reports by police making it easy for district attorneys to sabotage the prosecution. This is not unlike what used to happen in America barely decades ago vis-a-vis the lynching of African Americans.
Dr. Stanton, the US government has been silent on India's egregious behavior towards its Muslims. As Muslims were being killed in Delhi in February, President Trump, who was visiting Delhi then, held a joint press conference with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and he said, "Mr. Modi is bringing religious freedom to all its citizens." What role do you think the US can play in pressuring India to treat its citizens better?
I certainly hope so. I have always believed India and the United States are natural allies. We are the largest democracies in the world, and it is time for us to recognize that kinship. But unfortunately, it wasn't Trump, who I believe is anti-democratic, and also Modi, who I also believe is anti-democratic, to have this kind of kinship. Both of these men are autocratic type leaders. They do not want really to have democracy in their countries. They want one-party rule in a sense, that they want domination without the rule of law. As you know, we have just, I think, elected a new president in this country, and I don't think that Trump will be president much longer. We don't know what will happen in India because Modi's evidently still quite popular. I know his party has just won an election in Bihar. So there you have a real problem. A majority Hindu population has supported and re-elected Modi and the BJP. So I don't know what will happen exactly, but I do know that it's time for India to wake up to these calls by extremists to, exclude whole groups of people who've lived side by side in India for centuries.
Rashid Ahmed, you are a US citizen, and I know you and your organization, the Indian American Muslim Council, have been advocating with the US government for years to take a harder line on India. Tell us, what do you think of the US approach to India?
Let me start with the nearly forgotten events while President Trump was visiting India. The days when President Trump was hosted by India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Not too far from the venue, organized mobs affiliated by his party BJP or its mother organization RSS went on a rampage and killed 50 people. This was in February of this year. To date, neither President Trump nor State Department condemned or inquired about it with their counterparts. On October 28, last month, the National Investigative Agency or NIA, India's counter-terrorist task force, raided the homes and premises of human rights NGOs, activists and even journalists in Jammu and Kashmir as well as in Bangalore and Delhi. Those raided included Zafarul Islam Khan, a globally renowned and respected 72-year-old Muslim scholar who recently been chairman of the Delhi Minorities Commission, a statutory body. While still in office, Mr. Khan led a professional team to investigate the anti-Muslim violence in February in Delhi. This investigation concluded that Delhi police had not only aided and abetted this violence by Hindu extremists, but also participated in it. A day after his report became public, he was made to resign. Since then, he had been harassed by Mr. Modi's government. Instead of arresting and charging the perpetrators of these violence and murderers, the police have systematically targeted civil society groups and human rights defenders in a brutal crackdown. More than 1,000 Muslims, including students, professors, civil society leaders, and innocent Muslims have been arrested and accused of carrying out the violence against themselves, whereas those who publicly incited the violence are roaming free. 2 weeks ago, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government ordered to close the operations of Amnesty International in India. This is right after Amnesty International called upon New Delhi to immediately halt its intensifying suppression of dissent. What compelled Amnesty to call for an immediate halt to the suppression of dissent? In Kashmir, the NIA raided the homes and offices of two globally respected human rights activists.
How can justice be served in India if the perpetrators of the crimes against Indian Muslims go unpunished?
During and after a genocide, as I believe, during the genocide, those people who are committing it need to be indicted, they need to be sanctioned, they need to be excluded from the international community, they need to have their finances frozen, they need to not be able to get visas to go anywhere else. That sort of sanction is necessary. After a genocide, not only should there be courts to try those who have committed the crimes, but there should also be, I believe, a whole process of reconciliation within the country that is encouraged by the government. The courts that I have helped set up most specifically were the Rwandan Tribunal and the Cambodian Tribunal. I wrote the UN resolutions that created the Rwandan Tribunal, for example. So I believe that those people should be put on trial who committed a genocide. In many cases, however, the best place to put them on trial is within their own country, after they have been deposed from power, because trials within their own country are close to the people who saw the crimes, who have the evidence. They are part of the cultural tradition of that country. They will be supported by the people. And so that, I think, has a much deeper effect on a country. Rwanda has done that, for example. That we had the Rwandan Tribunal, but we knew it could only try, a few people, about 100 people, the leaders of the genocide. So other people who were participants in that genocide were tried according to traditional Rwandan procedure, which is an African procedure. It's one that, by the way, is oriented much more towards reconciliation than it is towards, any kind of brutal kind of punishment of the perpetrators. Because a lot of people who participate in genocides are doing so because they're just going along with everybody. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean that they're guiltless. It just means that the way you deal with the aftermath needs to be one in which both the victim and the perpetrator can reconcile with each other. My view is that's really possible in India. India has a long tradition of religious tolerance. It has other forces that are intolerant. What's needed in India is a resurgence of the forces of tolerance that have made India great.
Dr. Manuvi, what is the current situation with the dehumanization and demonization of India's Muslims?
Since the re-arrival of Modi government in India, this hateful narrative of otherizing, symbolizing and dehumanizing Indian Muslims as terrorists and termites has become at an all-time high. Popular public figures in media and Bollywood have openly called out Muslim groups as rats. There are over 400 groups on Facebook with membership ranging from 100,000 to 1 million, which have been actively inciting hate against Indian Muslims. The episodes of lynching of Muslim men is not only limited to the mob. In the state like Uttar Pradesh, the law enforcement itself is perpetrating the crime. There are ground reports confirming that at the beginning of this year, following the Delhi riots, young Muslim boys, several of them underage, were identified and picked from their houses to be brutalized inside the police stations. The presence of Hindutva vigilante groups in building polarized narrative and executing mass-scale murders like the one seen in Gujarat in 2002 should not be negated or forgotten. Indian Muslims are at the verge of massive persecution and the world should not silently watch it happen.
Qasim Rasul Ilyas, where do you think India is headed with Hindu nationalist bigotry?
Lynching, Triple Talaq Act, scrapping of Article 370, domicile laws, CAA law, Delhi riots and arrest are some aggressive Muslim bashing undertaken exclusively by Modi government, which encourages impunity after setting ablaze Muslim community with hate propaganda. It takes solace that they won the battle on the clash of civilization. Can a country which claims to be a largest democracy force its 14% of population into suppression and submission and deny their human and constitutional right without inviting the wrath of international community?
Thank you for everyone for joining this special program on the 10 stages of genocide in India's Muslims.